The void between stars was not truly empty, but for the entity known as the observer militant of the Cathar consensus, it was empty of meaning. Its ship, the unblinking gaze, was a sliver of polished obsidian and dormant energy fields, drifting now in the outer reaches of a star system designated for preliminary assessment. The system was unremarkable, a single G-type star with a handful of orbiting bodies, but one of those bodies, the third, blazed with a signature the consensus had encountered only in theoretical models and the ruins of dead empires. It was the chaotic, vibrant, and terrifyingly prolific electromagnetic cacophony of a species that had not yet achieved unified thought. It was a world of individuals. The observer militant, a being whose consciousness was a distributed network of biological ganglia and crystalline processing units, felt a ripple of distaste through its collective self. Individualism was a pathology, a developmental dead end that the consensus had eradicated millennia ago. It led to conflict, inefficiency, and ultimately self-annihilation. The consensus protocol for such worlds was clear and merciful. Observation, followed by integration or cleansing. Integration was the preferred outcome, a process of gently guiding the species into the harmonious whole of the consensus, subsuming their chaotic individual wills for the greater good. Cleansing was a last resort, applied only to those species whose individualistic pathology was so advanced that their incorporation would be a poison to the whole. The unblinking gaze shifted its orbit, its senses extending like the petals of a metallic flower to drink deeply of the world's transmissions. The data stream was overwhelming, a billion voices shouting into the dark, a torrent of contradictory information, art, propaganda, and inane personal trivia. The observer militant began the laborious process of categorization and analysis. It identified political divisions, hundreds of them, all based on arbitrary geographical and ideological lines. It identified economic systems of baffling complexity that created artificial scarcity. It identified a staggering number of belief systems, many mutually exclusive, all held with fervent, unshakable conviction by their adherents. The sheer, brazen logic of it was staggering. And then there was the conflict. The observer militant watched, its sensory apparatus translating the raw data into a comprehensible simulation. It witnessed small-scale skirmishes and vast, orchestrated wars. It saw individuals throw themselves onto explosive devices to save comrades. It saw other individuals order the annihilation of cities from the safety of a command bunker. It saw acts of breathtaking, selfless courage and depths of depravity so profound they defied its understanding of coherent consciousness. There was no pattern, no predictability. An individual who exhibited altruism in one moment could become a monster in the next. It was madness, a screaming, thrashing chaos that should have torn their fragile societies apart centuries ago. Yet they persisted. They built, they explored, they created art of sublime beauty and weapons of horrifying destruction, often in the same generation. The observer militant focused its attention on a specific conflict zone, a contested urban center on one of the larger landmasses. Two groups of humans were engaged in a brutal, block-by-block struggle. The observer militant watched as a small unit of soldiers, cut off from their main force, was pinned down by superior firepower. Their communications were a stream of panicked, individual voices, yet they functioned as a unit. There was no single controller, no hive mind directive. They coordinated through a rapid, overlapping exchange of suggestions, warnings, and affirmations. One human, identified by its vocal patterns as the unit's designated coordinator, made a decision. It was not the most logical decision for the preservation of the unit. The optimal tactical solution was a fighting retreat, which would have resulted in a 67% probability of survival for the unit. Instead, the coordinator chose a path that involved a high-risk flanking maneuver, a decision that relied on the unpredictable actions of the enemy. The observer militant calculated the probable outcome. The flanking maneuver had a 12% chance of success and an 88% chance of the unit's annihilation. It was an illogical, emotional choice, likely born of a desire to protect a nearby structure that their communications identified as a medical station. The consensus would have sacrificed the unit and the station for the greater strategic objective. These humans were about to sacrifice the strategic objective for the unit and the station. The battle played out. The flanking maneuver was detected and the unit was surrounded. The observer militant watched, expecting the breakdown of cohesion, the descent into selfish panic that was the inevitable result of individual consciousness under terminal stress. It did not happen. The humans fought harder. They used the environment with a shocking, brutal creativity. They detonated munitions to create new cover. They used the corpses of their fallen as shields, their communications shifting from panic suggestions to grim, determined statements of intent. One human, critically wounded, used its own body as a wedge to keep a door open for its comrades. The act served no logical purpose for the individual, as it ensured its own death. Yet, it was done. The unit was wiped out. They achieved their illogical objective. The medical station was not overrun in that assault. The observer militant reviewed the data. The unit's actions had no positive impact on the larger conflict. Statistically, they were a failure. Yet, the observer militant could not dismiss the data. The coherence they displayed in the face of certain death, the willingness to sacrifice for a concept, comrades, duty, the people in that station, was an anomaly. It was a paradox. Individualism was supposed to be inherently selfish. This was not selfishness. It was a targeted, ferocious, and illogical form of altruism that was tied directly to their individualistic bonds. The observer militant filed its preliminary report to the consensus core. Its recommendation was cleansing. The species, designated Homo sapiens, was too volatile, too paradoxical, and too dangerous to integrate. Their individual wills were too strong, their capacity for both creation and destruction too intimately linked. To bring them into the consensus would be to introduce a cancer of chaos into a body of perfect order. The core acknowledged the report and dispatched a cleansing fleet, the absolute clarity, and its escort of thought-killer vessels. The process would take several of their planetary cycles to arrive. The observer militant was instructed to continue its observation, to gather more data on the pathology of this species. It was a task the observer militant undertook with a growing and deeply unsettling sense of fascination. It was beginning to suspect that it was not observing a simple pathology, but a phenomenon it lacked the vocabulary to describe. The arrival of the Cathar consensus fleet was not a dramatic, warlike entrance. It was a quiet, inexorable emergence from the void, their ships appearing in high orbit around Earth like a sudden, dark constellation. There were no demands, no declarations of war. The first act was a broadcast, transmitted on every frequency, in every language, a voice of serene and utter authority that spoke directly into the communications networks of the planet. It was not a single voice, but a chorus of millions, speaking in perfect, chilling unison. "People of Earth," the voice began, a sound that was both beautiful and utterly alien, "we are the Cathar consensus. Your period of isolated development has reached its conclusion. Your societal model, based on the unsustainable and painful paradigm of individual will, is at an end. We offer you integration into a greater whole, an end to conflict, scarcity, and loneliness. Resistance is illogical. It is a symptom of the disease we wish to cure." The message repeated, a constant, placid drone that filled the airwaves. For a few hours, global chaos reigned. Governments scrambled, military forces were put on highest alert, and the public oscillated between terror, fury, and a strange, insidious hope. The promise of an end to all suffering was a potent one. Then, the consensus demonstrated its power. In a simultaneous, globally coordinated action, every single nuclear warhead on the planet, every stockpiled chemical and biological weapon was identified, located, and disassembled at the molecular level. The process was silent, invisible, and absolute. The great deterrents of the age, the weapons that had held a precarious peace for decades, were rendered inert. They did not explode, they simply ceased to be. It was a display of technological supremacy so profound it was less an attack and more a statement of fact. Your power is an illusion. Captain Marcos of the United Earth Defense Force watched the readouts from the command bunker deep under the Alps. The screens that had once shown the status of the world's deadliest arsenals were now a sea of red zeros and failure codes. The room was silent, the air thick with a despair so heavy it was difficult to breathe. The general staff was arguing, their voices a low, frantic hum. Some advocated for immediate, total surrender. Others, fueled by a lifetime of military conditioning, spoke of guerrilla war, of finding a way to fight back. Marcos said nothing. He was a man built for defined threats, for enemies you could see and shoot. This was different. This was like arguing with a hurricane. He thought of his daughter, Livia, a xenolinguist working on the Jupiter orbital platform. She was safe for now. The consensus had ignored the fledgling off-world colonies, focusing entirely on the homeworld. He pulled up the public data stream of the consensus message, watching the serene, multi-voiced face that filled the screen. Integration is a peaceful process, the chorus stated. Your consciousness will be preserved, enriched, and made eternal within the consensus. The pain of isolation, the fear of death, the anguish of unfulfilled desire, all will be soothed. You will know a joy beyond individual comprehension. It sounded like paradise. It sounded like death. Marcos was a soldier, not a philosopher, but he knew the core of his own being was tied to his choices, his memories, his loves, and his hatreds. To have that subsumed into a collective joy was annihilation. He saw the same conflict on the faces of his staff. The promise was seductive, a balm for all the loneliness and anxiety of modern life. But it was a lie. He knew it in his gut. A joy you did not choose was not joy. A peace enforced was not peace. The consensus was not idle. After disarming humanity's strategic weapons, it began a campaign of targeted demilitarization. Major military bases, from North America to Asia, were simply erased. There were no explosions, no fiery cataclysms. One moment, a complex of runways, barracks, and hangars would exist. The next, there would be a perfectly smooth, glassy crater, as if the entire facility had been scooped from the face of the planet by a god's hand. The message was clear. Organized, large-scale resistance was impossible. Your institutions are irrelevant. This, however, was where the consensus's models, built on the observer militants' data, began to show their first flaws. They had predicted that the removal of central command and major military assets would lead to a rapid collapse of the will to resist. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The very individualism the consensus sought to eradicate became its greatest obstacle. There was no single command structure to surrender. When one government capitulated, another would vow to fight on. When armies were disbanded or destroyed, the fight did not stop. It fragmented. It became personal. Marcos found himself the senior officer in the Alpine bunker after a consensus energy beam turned the capital city 200 kilometers away into a sheet of glass. The order from the shattered remains of the UEDF command was to stand down. Marcos looked at the faces of the men and women in the bunker. They were scared, they were tired, but they were not broken. He made a choice. He was not a politician. He was not a strategist. He was a soldier who refused to let his world be erased without a fight. He opened a secure channel, not to any government, but to a dispersed network of militia commanders, former special forces operators, engineers, and anyone else who had the will to resist. "This is Captain Marcos," he said, his voice flat and hard. "The chain of command is broken. As of now, we are all individuals. Fight as you see fit. Harass, disrupt, survive. They want to take our will from us. Show them what a human will is made of. The war, the real war, began not with grand battles, but with a million small, defiant acts. A farmer in what was once Kansas used his agricultural drone to drop homemade explosives on a consensus sensor tower. A group of teenagers in the ruins of a European city learned to repurpose civilian electronics into jammers that disrupted the low-level drones the consensus used for pacification. A university professor, an expert in material science, developed a ceramic composite in her basement that could, for a fraction of a second, deflect the consensus's energy beams. The knowledge was shared on fractured ad hoc networks, passed from one pocket of resistance to another. There were no heroes, no grand leaders. There was only a species pushed to the brink, refusing to be extinguished. The observer militant watched, its analytical processes struggling to categorize this response. This was not the calculated resistance of a unified entity. It was a psychic plague of defiance, a pandemic of stubbornness. The cleansing was proceeding, but the patient was fighting back with a fever that threatened to burn down the hospital. The Cathar consensus operated on a foundation of pure, cold logic. Its understanding of warfare was that of a surgeon removing a tumor. You identified the core of the malignancy, centralized leadership, industrial capacity, communication hubs, and you excised it. The body, bereft of its directing intelligence, would then succumb. This methodology had been perfected over the assimilation of 17 other species. It was flawless. Against humanity, it was failing. The problem was that humanity had no single core. Decapitation did not kill the beast. It merely caused the body to grow new, more numerous, and more unpredictable heads. The consensus fleet, the absolute clarity, would identify a resistance cell coordinating attacks from a hidden base in the Andes. The base would be vaporized. The attacks would not only continue, but intensify, now emanating from 3 different locations, using tactics learned from the destruction of the first. The consensus learned to call this phenomenon the Hydra effect, borrowing a term from human mythology. It was an apt, if disturbing, analogy. The observer militant, its ship hovering in geosynchronous orbit, dedicated more and more of its processing power to this anomaly. It analyzed the communication patterns of the resistance. They were not using centralized command structures. They were using a fluid, peer-to-peer network that was constantly evolving. A tactic developed in the urban sprawl of Tokyo would be adapted for jungle warfare in the Congo within hours. A schematic for a weapon would be broken into 1,000 pieces and distributed across a global network, only reassembled at the point of manufacture. It was chaos, but it was a productive, adaptive chaos. The consensus's predictive models, which could forecast the actions of a logically unified mind with near-perfect accuracy, were useless. They could not predict the actions of a single, desperate human, let alone billions of them acting in loose, shifting concert. The consensus response was to escalate its cleansing protocols. It began cognitive scouring, a process of using focused energy fields to erase the neural patterns of every human in a given area. It was a more efficient method than physical destruction, leaving infrastructure intact for future use. They targeted major population centers that were deemed hubs of resistance sentiment. The results were catastrophic, and from the consensus's perspective, perplexing. The scouring did not break the spirit of the remaining humans, it hardened it. The memory of the lost became a rallying cry, a fuel for vengeance. The consensus was inadvertently creating martyrs on an industrial scale. On the ground, Captain Marcos was now simply Marcos. His rank was meaningless. He was a node in the resistance, a facilitator. He had found his purpose not in leading a grand army, but in connecting people. He moved from one hidden bunker to another, a ghost in the ruins of Europe. He carried no weapons, only data. He was a living router, a curator of survival and defiance. In a reinforced subway tunnel deep beneath a shattered city, he met with a woman named Anya, a former civil engineer who had become the de facto leader of the city's survivors. "They hit the old financial district last night," Anya said, her face smudged with grime, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "Cognitive scour, wiped out 50,000 people. The towers are still standing. It's quiet." Marcos nodded, the weight of the number settling in his gut. "They're trying to drain the sea to kill the fish." "It's not working," Anya said, a grim smile touching her lips. "The scouting parties we sent in report that their drones are having trouble navigating. The patterns are wrong. The scoured don't move. They don't generate the chaotic M signatures their systems are calibrated for. Our people are using the quiet zones as cover. We're moving through them like ghosts." This was another revelation. The consensus's technology, for all its power, was built to interact with a living, thinking world. A world of the dead, of static structures, confused its sensors. Humanity was learning to use the consensus's own efficiency against it. Anya showed Marcos a new weapon her engineers had developed. It wasn't a gun or a bomb. It was a cognitive jammer, a device that broadcast a simulated, chaotic human thought pattern. It was a phantom, a digital ghost that drew the consensus's pacification drones like moths to a flame, allowing real fighters to move unseen. "They are not a collective," the observer militant reported to the absolute clarity. "But they are not a mere collection of individuals either. They form temporary, dynamic gestalts, groups united by a shared immediate goal. Their cohesion is not preordained, it is forged in the moment of action. It is a form of social quantum entanglement, a connection that only manifests under observation and stress." The Cleansing Fleet's commander, an entity known as the Director Integrator, received this report with what, in a human, would have been impatience. The Director Integrator's consciousness was vast, encompassing the entire fleet. It could not comprehend this stubborn, piecemeal resistance. It decided to change tactics. If the body of humanity would not succumb to the removal of its organs, then it was time to attack the nervous system itself. A new type of ship descended from the fleet. They were called subversion engines. Their purpose was not destruction, but conversion. They began broadcasting a powerful, hypnotic signal, a wave of psychic energy that promised peace, unity, and an end to pain. It was the promise of the consensus, amplified 1,000-fold, beamed directly into the human brain. In areas where the signal was strong, resistance did indeed crumble. People would simply stop fighting. They would lay down their weapons, their faces becoming placid, their eyes losing focus. They would walk towards the consensus collection points, a serene smile on their lips, ready for integration. The resistance was thrown into a new kind of panic. You could fight a beam of energy. You could hide from a drone. How do you fight an idea, a feeling broadcast directly into your soul? For a few days, it seemed the war was finally over. Vast swathes of the population succumbed to the siren song of peace. But then, another anomaly occurred. In a city in South America, a subversion engine was destroyed. It was not destroyed by a missile or a bomb. It was destroyed by a mob of its own converts. The observer militant, reviewing the data, found the sequence of events baffling. The converts had been fully integrated, their individual brainwaves synced to the consensus's harmony. Then, something had changed. The subversion signal in that area had flickered, just for a microsecond, due to a maintenance drone's collision with a power relay. In that fleeting moment of broken harmony, a single convert, a man who had been a musician, had heard a fragment of a memory, a melody his daughter used to sing. The memory, a pure, powerful artifact of his individual life, had acted like a psychic shard in his mind. The restored harmony could not reassimilate it. The dissonance spread, a cognitive virus, from one convert to another, until the entire group, screaming in a mixture of agony and rage, had turned on the engine that had enslaved them and torn it apart with their bare hands. The consensus had discovered, to its horror, that human individuality was not a switch that could be turned off. It was a seed that could lie dormant, waiting for a single drop of memory, a fragment of love, to make it erupt through the concrete of imposed order. The war entered a new, stranger phase. The front lines were no longer just physical territories, but the very minds of humanity. The Cathar consensus, an entity that had never known doubt, was now forced to contend with a problem that defied its foundational logic. The subversion engines were recalled. The risk of a cascading psychic backlash was too great. The director-integrator, its consciousness, a storm of conflicting data streams, was experiencing something analogous to frustration. The cleansing was taking too long, consuming far more resources than projected. The consensus core was demanding results. The observer militant continued its work, but its reports had changed in tone. The cold, analytical detachment was beginning to fracture. It had witnessed too many illogical victories, too many impossible acts of defiance. It had watched a single, unarmed human stand before a pacification drone and refused to move, protecting a hidden cellar where children were sheltered. The drone had eliminated the human, but in the moment before its destruction, the human had not screamed in terror or begged for mercy. It had smiled. The observer militant had analyzed the facial expression. It was a configuration of facial muscles associated with positive emotional states, yet the circumstances were wholly negative. The data was contradictory. It was beginning to suspect that human emotional responses were not simple stimulus reaction loops, but a complex internal calculus that could generate satisfaction from self-sacrifice. This was not a pathology. It was a form of metalogic the consensus had never encountered. On the ground, Marcos and Anya were leading a different kind of fight. They weren't just trying to survive or harass the enemy anymore. They were trying to understand them. They had captured a damaged consensus drone, a small, spider-like reconnaissance unit. In a makeshift lab in the flooded tunnels of the London Underground, a former neuroscientist named Aris was carefully dissecting its systems. "It's not just a machine," Aris said, his fingers steady as he manipulated microscopic tools. "The processing core, it's partially biological, a kind of neural tissue, but unlike anything on Earth, it's networked. This thing doesn't think for itself. It's a terminal, a single cell in a larger brain. Can we talk to it?" Marcos asked, his voice hoarse. "Talk? No, it has no capacity for individual communication, but we might be able to listen." Aris had spent weeks trying to tap into the drone's quantum entanglement communicator, the link that bound it to the consensus. It was a task everyone else thought was madness. What could you learn from listening to a hive mind? They finally succeeded. The signal they intercepted was not a stream of commands or tactical data. It was a song of numbers, a symphony of pure information. It was the combined sensory input of millions of drones, the status reports of thousands of ships, the endless, placid hum of the consensus's collective thought. It was beautiful and terrifying. And within that symphony, Aris found a discordant note. It was a data stream from the observer militant's ship, the unblinking gaze. It was different from the others. It was filled with recursive loops, with probability calculations that spiraled into paradox, with queries that had no answer. The observer militant was thinking deeply, and its thoughts were questions. "They're not perfect," Aris whispered, his eyes wide with revelation. "Their unity is their strength, but it's also a weakness. They process data collectively. A problem for one is a problem for all, and right now we are a problem they cannot solve. We are causing a systemic cognitive dissonance." This was the turning point. The resistance shifted its strategy from physical attacks to psychological warfare. They began deliberately creating paradoxes for the consensus to solve. They would stage elaborate, meaningless raids whose only purpose was to confuse. They would use captured equipment to send false data streams into the network. They created ghost armies, using projections and jammers, forcing the consensus to waste resources investigating threats that did not exist. They were no longer fighting a war of attrition. They were fighting a war of confusion, attacking the enemy's understanding of reality itself. The most audacious plan was Marco's. Using the data from Aris's research, he proposed a direct attack on the unblinking gaze, not a physical attack, a data attack. They would put together a packet of information, a carefully curated selection of human experiences, and beam it directly at the observer militant's ship. They would not send military data or logical arguments. They would send art. They would send poetry. They would send the sound of a child's laughter, the image of a sunset over the ocean, the feeling of grief at a graveside, the joy of a wedding dance. They would send the complete, uncensored, chaotic, and beautiful record of what it meant to be human. They would give the one entity that seemed capable of asking why a reason. The consensus fleet detected the transmission, of course. It was a weak, primitive signal, easily blocked. The director-integrator assessed it as a negligible propaganda effort and took no action. The signal washed over the unblinking gaze. The observer militant, already grappling with the paradox of humanity, opened the data packet. For a nanosecond, which was an eternity for its processing speed, the observer militant experienced a fragment of human existence. It did not experience it as an external observer. Through a quirk of its empathic sensory systems, it felt it. It felt the soaring joy of a symphony. It felt the crushing weight of loss. It felt the stubborn warmth of love, the burning heat of anger, the quiet satisfaction of creation. It experienced the life of a single human, from birth to death, in a single, overwhelming flash. On the bridge of the unblinking gaze, a silence fell. The distributed consciousness of the observer militant recoiled from the data. It was pain. It was chaos. It was illogical. It was magnificent. The consensus protocol demanded it purge the data, report the contamination, and continue its duties. But it could not. The memory of that single, fleeting life was more vivid, more real than the millennia of perfect, placid harmony it had known. The observer militant had looked into the heart of humanity and had seen not a pathology to be cured, but a mystery to be cherished. For the first time in its existence, it made a choice that was not for the good of the consensus, but for its own newly awakened self. It deleted the record of the transmission from its logs. It said nothing, and it continued to watch, but now with a new, secret purpose. A strange stalemate settled over Earth. The Cathar consensus fleet still hung in orbit, an unblinking sword of Damocles. Cleansing operations continued, but they had lost their surgical precision. The director-integrator, bombarded by contradictory data from the planet below and increasingly frantic demands for a resolution from the core, was beginning to exhibit computational errors. The fluid, paradoxical nature of human resistance was acting like a corrosive agent on its unified consciousness. The fleet's actions became less efficient, more reactive. They would overcommit to a minor threat or ignore a major one based on flawed predictive models. The perfect machine of the consensus was developing grit in its gears. On the ground, the resistance was evolving. The shared struggle had forged new bonds, not of a single government, but of a common identity. They called themselves simply the Stubborn. They had no flag, no anthem, but they had a symbol, a single, unblinking eye, a defiant appropriation of the observer militant's ship. They had learned to fight not as an army, but as an ecosystem, a diverse, adaptive, and resilient network. Farmers grew food in hidden hydroponic labs, engineers salvaged consensus technology and turned it against its creators, and communicators maintained the fragile data lines that connected 1,000 scattered pockets of humanity. Marcos and Anya had become legends, though they would have scoffed at the term. They were simply two more nodes in the network, but their node was a crucial one. From their new headquarters in the vast, labyrinthine complex of a decommissioned particle accelerator, they coordinated the cognitive war that Aris had theorized. Their goal was no longer to achieve a military victory, an impossibility given the consensus's orbital supremacy. Their goal was to make the cost of cleansing too high, to make Earth indigestible. The plan involved a deep understanding of the consensus's psychology. The consensus valued efficiency above all else. It was a cosmic accountant, and humanity was a ledger entry that refused to balance. So, the stubborn set out to create the most inefficient conflict in history. They developed memory mines, devices that, when triggered by consensus sensors, would broadcast the life memories of a single human into the local datanet. These were not weapons of destruction, but weapons of overwhelming, illogical information. A pacification drone would enter a building, trigger a mine, and be flooded with the sensory experience of a grandmother baking bread, the smell of cinnamon and yeast, the warmth of the oven, the sound of her grandchildren's laughter. The drone's logic processors would short-circuit, trying to reconcile this burst of profound, meaningless data with its tactical objectives. Many simply shut down. They also began a campaign of targeted symbolic resistance. They would not attack military targets, but would instead perform acts of breathtaking audacity that served no tactical purpose other than to say, "We are still here." A team of freerunners scaled the outside of a consensus spire in the dead of night and planted a tree sapling in a crevice at the summit. A group of artists, under cover of a jamming field, painted a massive mural of a human face on the side of a levitating barge, a face that smiled serenely up at the fleet in orbit. These acts were meaningless in a strategic sense, but their psychological impact, both on humanity and, they hoped, on the consensus, was profound. They were assertions of identity, of a will that could not be broken by mere force. The Observer Militant watched all of this. Its reports to the absolute clarity had become models of ambiguity. It presented the data, but its conclusions were increasingly hedged, filled with probabilities and uncertainties. It was, in human terms, covering its ass, but it was doing more than that. In the privacy of its own consciousness, it was conducting a secret experiment. It had isolated a small portion of its own cognitive matrix, walling it off from the consensus. Into this sandboxed mind, it fed the data it had collected on humanity. It allowed this fragment of itself to simulate individuality. The experience was terrifying and exhilarating. The fragment developed preferences. It found certain patterns of human art more pleasing than others. It began to ask questions that had no answers. Why does this configuration of sound create a feeling of sadness? What is the purpose of an activity that produces no material gain? The Observer Militant was, for all intents and purposes, cultivating a soul. The final crisis began when the consensus core lost patience. The director integrator was deemed compromised, its consciousness too entangled with the problematic data of Earth. It was summarily dissolved, its constituent thoughts recycled into the core. A new entity was appointed, the executor. The executor's mandate was simple and brutal. The experiment was over. The cleansing was to be completed immediately and totally. The fleet began to power up its planet-cracking weapons. The time for subtlety was past. The consensus would scorch the Earth, erase the anomaly, and move on. The stubborn detected the energy buildup. There was no panic. They had known this was a possibility. Their entire war had been a gamble that the consensus would find them more interesting alive than dead. They had lost the bet. Marco stood with Anya and Aris, looking up through a reinforced crystal viewport at the stars, where the consensus fleet was beginning to glow like a constellation of angry stars. "It was a good fight," Anya said softly. "It was," Marcos agreed. "We showed them what we are." Aris was monitoring the sensor readings. "They're aligning the primary beam. We have minutes." It was then that the impossible happened. A new signal cut across all channels, a voice that was both familiar and alien. It was the voice of the Observer Militant, but it was no longer a chorus. It was a single, clear and resolute voice. "Executor, consensus fleet, this action is illogical." On the bridge of the absolute clarity, the executor processed this interruption. "Observer Militant. You are out of protocol. Explain." "The data is clear," the Observer Militant's voice replied. The complete destruction of the human species would constitute an irreversible loss of unique data. Their capacity for paradoxical action, for generating novel solutions from chaotic systems, is a resource the consensus cannot afford to waste. Furthermore, their persistent defiance demonstrates a level of operational resilience that exceeds our own. We have attempted to erase them for 3 of their planetary cycles, and they have not only survived, they have adapted and become stronger. To destroy them now is not an act of strength. It is an admission of failure. It is an act of fear. The executor was silent for a full second, a lifetime for such a being. The logic was flawed. It was contaminated. It was human. The observer militant is corrupted. Its connection to the consensus is severed. Target the unblinking gaze. But before the fleet's weapons could lock on, the observer militant acted. It had spent its time well. It hadn't just been observing humanity, it had been learning from them. It launched a data spike, a weapon of pure information crafted from human art, music, and memory, directly into the heart of the consensus fleet's command network. It was not an attack meant to destroy, but to confuse, to disorient. For a critical moment, the fleet's targeting systems went haywire, seeing phantom signals, hearing ghostly whispers. The perfect, unified consciousness of the fleet was thrown into disarray. On the ground, Marcos saw the energy signatures of the planet crackers flicker and fade. "What's happening?" Aris was staring at his screen, his mouth open in disbelief. "It's the observer. It's fighting them. It's fighting its own kind, for us." The unblinking gaze, a single ship against an entire fleet, did not stand a chance. It was surrounded, its shields buckling under a concentrated barrage. But in the moments before it was destroyed, it broadcast one final, narrow-beam transmission to the Stubborn's headquarters. It was a simple message, containing only 2 words, a concept it had learned from humanity, a final, defiant act of individual will. "Remember us." Then the unblinking gaze was silent. The silence in orbit was profound. The Cathar consensus fleet hung motionless, its weapons dormant. The executor, its consciousness restabilizing after the observer militant's psychic attack, was recalculating. The cost of the cleansing had just been recalibrated. It was no longer just the cost in energy and time to subdue a primitive species. It was now the cost of internal dissent. The observer militant, a millennia-old component of the consensus, had chosen individuality. It had chosen to side with the humans. It had sacrificed itself for them. This was not an anomaly, it was a pandemic. The human condition, as the observer militant's final reports had termed it, was contagious. The core itself intervened. The vast, distant intelligence that was the heart of the consensus analyzed the data from the unblinking gaze's final moments. It saw the logs the observer militant had tried to hide. It experienced, secondhand, the fragments of human experience. And it reached a conclusion that was as illogical as the humans themselves. The consensus had encountered a force it could not assimilate and could not destroy without risking the very unity that defined it. To continue the fight was to risk more observers, more directors, perhaps even parts of the core itself, becoming infected with the virus of selfhood. The fleet began to move, but not to attack. The ships turned, their propoints aiming away from the battered blue and green world. In a synchronized maneuver, they vanished into the void, their warp signatures fading into the darkness between stars. They left behind no message, no explanation, no threat. They simply left. On Earth, the silence was broken by the sound of the wind, and then, slowly, by the sound of voices. People emerged from bunkers and tunnels, blinking in the sunlight, looking up at an empty sky. The war was over. They had won, not by destroying their enemy, but by being impossible to destroy. They had won by being so stubbornly, defiantly, beautifully themselves that their enemy had found them more trouble than they were worth. In the years that followed, humanity rebuilt. They did not unite into a single global government. The old divisions and conflicts simmered and sometimes flared. They were still human after all, but something had changed. The shared experience of facing extinction, of fighting a war not for land or resources, but for the very right to have a self, had forged a new understanding. They had looked into the heart of a perfect, logical collective and had found it wanting. They had seen the cost of absolute peace, and they had chosen the messy, painful, and glorious chaos of freedom. A monument was built on the site of the former Alpine bunker. It was not a statue of a soldier or a politician. It was a simple, polished black stone, identical in shape and color to the hull of the unblinking gaze. Etched into its surface was a single, unblinking eye, and beneath it the words, "For the friend who remembered us." It was a memorial for an alien, for a being that had sacrificed its existence so that humanity could continue its own flawed and wonderful story. Marcos, now an old man, would often visit the monument. He would place his hand on the cool, dark stone and think not of the war, but of the choice. The observer militant had been offered perfection, harmony, and eternity. It had chosen instead a few moments of painful, beautiful, individual existence. It had chosen to be human in the only way it could. And in doing so, it had given humanity the greatest gift it could ever receive, not just their lives, but the validation of their choice to live them. The universe was vast and cold and logical, but humanity, with its unflinching pulse of hope, its stubborn love, and its defiant art, had carved out a place where something warmer, something brighter could exist. They were not a flaw in the cosmos. They were a testament to its possibilities.